Alice by Christina Henry. If she moved her head all the way up against the wall and tilted it to the left, she could see the edge of the moon from the bars. Just a silver sliver, almost close enough to eat. A sliver of cheese, a sliver of cake, a cup of tea to be polite. Someone had given her a cup of tea once. Someone with blue-green eyes and long ears. Funny how she couldn't remember his face, though. All that part was hazy. Her memory of him wrapped in smoke over the eyes and the ears were long and furry. When they found her, all she would say was, "The rabbit, rabbit, the rabbit," over and over. And when she acted like that, they said she was mad. Alice knew she wasn't mad. Maybe. Not deep down. But the powders they gave her made her all muzzy and sideways. Sometimes she felt mad. Everything had happened just as she said, when she could say something besides rabbit. She and Dor went into the old city for Dor's birthday. 16th birthday. 16 candles on your cake, a sliver of cake, and a cup of tea for you, my dear. They both went in, but only Alice came out. 2 weeks later came Alice, covered in blood, babbling about tea and a rabbit, wearing a dress that wasn't hers, red running down the insides of her thighs. Blue marks on her thighs where fingers had been. Her hand went without thought to her left cheek, touched the long thick scar that followed the line of bone from her hairline to the top of her lip. Her face had been flayed open when they found her. She couldn't say how or why. It had been open for a long while. The blood oozing from it had gone black and brackish, the skin around it tattered at the edges. The doctors told her parents they had done their best, but she would never be beautiful again. Her sister said it was her own fault. If she stayed out of Old City as she was supposed to, this would never have happened. There was a reason why they lived in the new city, the ring of shiny new buildings that kept the old city at bay. The old city wasn't for people like them. It was for the filth you threw away. All children were warned about dangers of straying to the old city. Alice didn't belong there. The hospital where Alice had lived for the last 10 years was in the old city, so her sister was wrong. Alice did belong there. Sometimes her parents came to visit, doing their duty, their noses wrinkled like she was something that smelled bad. Even though the attendants always dragged her out and gave her a bath first. She hated baths. They were icy cold and rough with scrubbing. And she never was permitted to clean herself. If she struggled or cried, they would hit her with a bath brush and pinch her hard enough to leave a mark. Always somewhere that couldn't be seen, the side of her breast or the soft part of her belly, with a promise of more where that came from unless she behaved. Her parents didn't visit so much anymore. Alice couldn't really remember the last time, but she knew it had been a long time. The days all ran together in her room. No books to read, no things to do. Hatcher said that she should exercise so she would be fit when she got out. Somewhere in her heart, Alice knew she would never get out. It was a broken thing, and the new city did not like broken things. They liked the new and the whole. Alice hardly recalled when she was new and whole. That girl seemed like someone else she'd known once, long ago and far away. Alice, a voice through the mouse hole. Many years before, a mouse had gotten into the wall and chewed through the batting between her cell and Hatcher's. Alice didn't know what had happened to the mouse. Probably got caught in a trap in the kitchens, or went out on the riverside and drowned. But the mouse had led her to Hatcher, a rough voice coming through the wall. She really thought she'd gone round the bend at first, hearing voices coming from nowhere. Hey you, the voice said. She looked around wildly, afraid, scuttled into a corner on the far side of the window opposite the door. Hey you, down here, the voice said. Alice resolutely put her fingers in her ears. Everyone knew hearing voices was a sign of madness, and she promised herself she would not be mad no matter what they said, no matter how she felt. After several moments of happy silence, she released her fingers and looked around the room in relief. A great sigh exhaled from the walls. The mouse hole you knit. Alice stared in alarm at the small opening in the corner opposite. Somehow, a talking mouse was worse than voices in her head. If mice were talking, then there really were men with blue-green eyes and long furry ears. And while she didn't remember his face, she did remember she'd been afraid. She stared at the mouse hole like something horrible might suddenly emerge from it, like the rabbit himself would unfold from that space and finish whatever he had started. Another sigh, this one shorter, much more impatient. You're not hearing voices, and a mouse is not speaking to you. I'm in the room next to yours. I can see you through the hole. You're not crazy, and there's no magic. So will you please come down here? Speak with me before I go madder than I already have. If you're not in my head, and you're not magic, then how do you know what I'm thinking? Alice asked. Her voice was suspicious. She was beginning to wonder whether this wasn't some trick of the doctor's, some way to draw her into a trap. The attendants gave her a powder with her breakfast and dinner to keep her calm, they said. But she knew that those powders still allowed her some freedom to be Alice, to think and dream, and try to remember the lost bits of her life. When they took her out of her room for a bath or a visit, she sometimes saw other patients, people standing still with dead eyes and drool on their chins, people who were alive and didn't know it. Those people were difficult to deal with. They got injections instead of powders. Alice didn't want injections, so she wasn't going to say or do anything that would alarm the doctors. Doctors who might try to be tricking her with voices in the wall. I know what you're thinking, 'cause that's what I'd be thinking if I were you, the voice said. We're in the loony bin, aren't we? Now come over and have a look through the hole and you'll see. She stood cautiously, still unsure it was not a trick. Whether of her mind or the doctor's, she crossed under the window and crouched by the mouse hole. All I can see is your knees, the voice complained. Come all the way down, won't you? Alice lowered to her stomach, keeping her head well away from the opening. She had a vague fear that a needle might flash through the hole and plunge into her eye. Once her cheek was on the ground, she could see through the small, tight opening. On the other side was an iron-gray eye, part of a nose. There was a bulge just where the rest of the nose disappeared from view, like it might have been broken once. It didn't look like any doctor she knew, but Alice wasn't taking any chances. Let me see your whole face, she said. Good, the grey eye said. You're thinking? That's good, not just a pretty face then. Alice's hand moved automatically to cover her scar. Then she remembered she was lying on that side of her face, and he couldn't really see it anyway. Let him think she was pretty if he wanted. It would be nice to be pretty to someone, even with her fair hair all snarled and nothing to wear but a woolen shift. She heard the swish-swish of wool on batting, as the grey eye moved away from the hole and became two grey eyes, a long broken nose, and a bushy black beard with flecks of white in it. "All right, then," the voice asked. "I'm Hatcher." And that was how they met. Hatcher was 10 years older than Alice, and nobody ever came to see him. "Why are you here?" she asked one day, long after they were friends, or at least friends who never really saw each other. "I killed a lot of people with an axe," he said. "That's how I got my name. Hatcher." "What was your name before?" Alice asked. She was surprisingly undisturbed by the knowledge that her new friend was an axe murderer. It seemed unrelated to who he was now, the rough voice and the grey eyes through the hole in the wall. "I don't remember," he said. "I don't remember anything from before, really. They found me with a bloody axe in my hand. 5 people dead all around me, slashed to bits. I tried to do the same thing for the police when they came for me, so I must have killed those people." "Why did you do it?" "I don't remember," he said. His voice changed a little. It became hard. "It's like there's this haze over my eyes, like smoke filling everything up. I remember the weight of the axe in one hand, hot blood on my face and in my mouth. I remember the sound of the blade and soft flesh." "I remember that too," Alice said. Although she didn't know why she said that. For a moment it had been true, though. She could hear the sound of knife piercing skin, that sliding, slicing noise, and someone screaming. "Did you kill a lot of people too?" Hatcher asked. "I don't know," Alice said. "I might have." "It's all right if you did," Hatcher said. "I would understand." "I really don't know," Alice said. "I remember before, and I remember after, but that fortnight is gone, save for a few flashes." "The man with the long ears?" "Yes," Alice said. "The man who hunted her faceless through her nightmares." "When we get out, we'll find him, and then you'll know what happened to you," Hatcher said. That had been 8 years before, and they were both still here. Rooms side by side in a hospital that had no intention of ever letting them go. "Alice," Hatcher said again. "Can't sleep." She blinked away the memory brought on by the moon and the sound of his voice. "I can't sleep either, Hatch," she said, crawling along the floor to the mouse hole. It was much darker down here. There was no light in their room save for that silver moon through the bars, and the occasional passage of a lamp by an attendant walking the halls. She could not see the color of his eyes, only the wet gleam of them. "The Jabberwock's awake, Alice," Hatcher said. It was then she noticed his voice was thin and reedy. Hatcher wasn't often afraid. Mostly he seemed strong, almost relentlessly so. All day long she heard him in his room, grunting with effort as he went through his exercises. When the attendants came to take Hatcher to his bath, there was always a lot of noise, punching and kicking and yelling. More than once Alice heard the crunch of bone and an angry curse of an attendant. She asked once how come he didn't get injections like all the other troublemakers. He'd grinned. his grey eyes crinkling at the corners, and said the injections made him wild, wilder than before. So after that, they left him alone. He didn't even get powders in his food. Hatcher was never scared, except when he talked about the Jabberwock. "There's no Jabberwock, Hatch," Alice said. Her voice was low and soothing. She'd heard tales of the monster before, not often, although lately it seemed to be on his mind more. "No, you don't believe in him, but he's here, Alice. They keep him downstairs in the basement. And when he's awake, I can feel him," Hatcher said. There was a pleading note under the fear, and Alice relented. After all, she believed in a man with rabbit ears, and Hatcher accepted that without question. "What can you feel?" she asked. "I feel the night crawling up all around, blotting out the moon. I hear blood running down the walls, rivers of it, in the streets below. I feel his teeth closing around me. That's what he'll do, Alice, if he's ever set free. He's been in prison here a long time, longer than you and me." "How could anyone trap such a beast?" Alice wondered aloud. Hatcher shifted restlessly on the floor. She could hear him moving around. "I don't know for sure," he said, and his voice was quieter now, so that she had to strain to hear him. "I think a magician must have done it." "A magician?" Alice asked. This was far-fetched than anything Hatcher had said before. "All the magicians are gone. They were driven out or killed centuries ago, during the Purge. This place is not that old. How could a magician have captured the Jabberwock and imprisoned it here?" Only a magician would have the skill," Hatcher insisted. "No ordinary man would survive the encounter." Alice was willing to indulge his fantasy of a monster in the basement, but she couldn't countenance this myth about magician. It didn't seem wise to argue, though. Hatcher took no powders and had no injections, and sometimes he could get agitated. If he got agitated, he might howl for hours or beat his hands against the wall until they were bloody despite the padding. So she said nothing, only listened to his shallow breath and the cries of the other inmates echoing through the building. "Wish I could hold your hand," Hatcher said. "I've never seen you all together, you know, just a bits through the hole. I try to put all the bits together in my head so I can see all of you, but it doesn't look quite right. In my head, you're just grey eyes and a beard," Alice said. Hatcher laughed softly, but there was no mirth in it. "Like the rabbit, just eyes and fur." "What would have happened if we met on the street, Alice? Would you have said hello?" She hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to hurt his feelings, but neither did she want to lie. Her parents lied. They said things like, "You're looking well," and "We're sure you'll be home soon." Things Alice knew were not true. "Alice?" Hatcher asked again and brought her back to him. "I don't know if we would have seen each other to say hello," she said carefully. "I lived in the new city, and I think you seem like you were from the old city." "Well, la-di-da," Hatcher said, and his voice was hard. "Fancy girl wouldn't soil her dainty hem in the old city, except you did. You got good and soiled, and now you're here just like me." His words were like knotted fists in her gut, and all the breath seemed to leave her for a moment. But they were true words, and she would not pretend otherwise. The truth was all she had left. The truth. Hatcher. she said. We're both here. There was a long silence between them. Alice waited in the darkness, the moonlight shifting on the floor. Hatcher seemed to be walking the knife's edge tonight, and she would not be the one to knock him off. I'm sorry, Alice, he said finally. He sounded more like the Hatch she knew. Don't, she started, but he cut her off. You should not have said such things. You're my only light, Alice. Without you, I would have succumbed to this place long ago. The Jabberwock's awake and makes me think of things I should not. The sound of blade in flesh, she said, echoing the memory of his words. I've warm blood on my hands, Badger said. I almost like myself when I think those thoughts, as if that's who I really am. At least you have some idea, Alice said. I never had the chance to find out. I lost my way first. She heard him shifting again on the floor. I feel like I've got bugs inside my skin, he said. Sing me a song. I don't know any songs, she said, surprised by the request. Yes, you do, he said. You sing it all day long. And you're not singing it, you're humming. Something about a butterfly? Butterfly? She asked. But as soon as she said this, it came back to her. And she heard her mother's voice in her head. The sound was so painful, piercing her heart, this remembrance of love that was lost to her forever. She began to sing aloud to cover the memory with her own voice. Her voice trailed off, her throat full of love and loss and pain. Hatchet said nothing, but she heard his breath go deep and even. She let her eyes fall shut. She matched her breath to his, and it was almost like she was holding his hand as the night closed in. Alice dreamed of blood. Blood on her hands and under her feet, blood in her mouth and pouring from her eyes. The room was filled with it. Outside the door, Hatcher stood hand in hand with something dark and hideous, a thing crafted of shadow with flashing silver teeth. Don't take him from me, she said, or tried to say, but she could not speak, through the blood in her mouth choking her. Her eyes were covered with smoke then, and she couldn't see Hatch or the monster anymore. Heat enfolded her body, and then there was nothing but fire. 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 Alice, wake up. The hospital's on fire. Alice opened her eyes. Hatcher's grey one was pressed to the mousehole. It was wild with fear and anticipation. At last, he said. Stay low, away from the smoke, and get near the door, not in front of it. Alice blinked as he disappeared. The dream still clung to her brain and her mouth was dry. Her shift clung to her body and her face was wet with sweat. The odor of smoke finally permeated her nostrils and her fuzzy head, and there was another smell too. Like cooking meat. She didn't want to think about what that might be. Alice turned so she was flat on her back, and saw a thick blanket of smoke just a few inches from her face. The heat beneath made the floor agony to lie upon, but there was no way to escape it. The sounds filtered in then, a crack of flame, of heavy objects crashing to the ground. Horrible, horrible screams. And close by, the repeated grunts and pounding of someone slamming his body into the wall. Hatch was trying to break the door down in his room. The noise was terrible. Alice did not think it was possible. The walls might be soft, but the doors were iron. He would kill himself. Hatcher, no, she cried, but he could not hear her. There was a sound of something crunching, but Hatcher did not cry out, and then there was no more noise. Hatcher, she said. her voice soft and sad. 2 tears leaked from the corner of her eye. There's no point in getting up then if Hatcher was gone. The smoke and the noise told Alice that the fire was well under way. The attendants and the doctors were not bothered to free the patients, especially when most families would be thrilled to be free of the burden of their mad relatives, so they would all burn. Alice found that she was not as distressed about this as she ought to be. Perhaps it was the powder in last night's dinner, or the smoke that filled her lungs in place of air. She felt very calm. She would just lie there and wait until the fire came. Her eyes closed again, and she drifted away to a place she'd never been in real life. A silver lake tucked in a green valley, wildflowers dotting the shore. There was no smell of medicine there, or harsh burning soap. There was no smoke, no pain, no heartache, and no blood. It was the place she always went, the place where her mind hid when the doctors asked questions she did not want to answer, or her parents sighed in disappointment. Something grabbed her around the shoulders and her eyes flew open in shock. It had been years since anyone had touched her except to drag her to the bath. Hatcher's face was close to hers, twisted in anger, and blood ran from a cut on the side of his head. "I told you to get near the door, you silly nit," he said, dragging her up to sitting, and then immediately pushing her down to her belly. "Follow me," he said, crawling toward the door. The door opened. She followed automatically, keeping his filthy bare heels in sight. She wanted to ask how he'd gotten out, how he wasn't battered and dead, but he was moving along with surprising quickness in the hall. He paused after a few moments so she could catch up to him. There was no one except the two of them, and frantic pounding of other patients still trapped in their boxes. It was then she noticed that his right arm hung at an odd angle. He was only using his left to pull his body along. "Hatch, what happened?" she asked. She was out of breath from just that short period of exertion. "It came out when I broke the door frame," he said. "I'll fix it later. We have to go. The floor's getting hotter, and he's almost out." "Who?" Alice asked. He started along again. "The Jabberwock." "Hatch," she said, trying to keep up with him. Her lungs and throat were burning. "We're going the wrong way. The stairs are behind us." "The stairs are on fire," Hatch said. "I've already checked. We've got to go out this way." "But Hatch," Alice said, shaking her head from side to side to clear it. The smoke was getting to her. "We're on the 3rd floor." "We'll go back to the river. Just keep up, Alice." "The river?" he said, and a faint alarm sounded in her head. There was something about the river. She couldn't recall exactly what it was. Just then they passed the door of a patient who was repeatedly throwing himself against the iron and screaming. The cloud of smoke above them blocked the small viewing window, so Alice was fairly certain the man could not see them escaping. She felt a tinge of guilt all the same as they went by. "What about the others?" Alice asked. "Shouldn't we let them out?" "There's no time," Hatcher said. "They would only be millstones in any case. They've no sense. We'd have to lead them round there like children. And then what? We take them with us? No, Alice. It's best to leave them as they are. We must get away before he's free." It was a cold thing, he said, but true. Not the bit about the Jabberwock getting free, but the other part. She and Hatcher would not be able to safely lead the others to freedom without endangering their own lives. Hatcher reached the end of the hallway before Alice did. He came to his knees. She noticed that he held a small ring of keys in his hand. "Where did you get those?" she asked. "From the attendant at the top of the stairs." "How do you think I opened your door?" he asked as he methodically fitted first one key, then another, then another. "There was nobody in the corridor when we came out," she said. "He took his keys and I threw him down the stairs. That's how I knew the steps were on fire." the fifth key clicked, and Hatcher pushed open the door, waving her inside the room. A cloud of smoke followed them in before Hatcher was able to close the door behind them, but it dissipated quickly as the far window was open. The heavy, seething air of the city, hardly fresh, poured into the room. Still, it had been years since Alice had smelled anything but the rank asylum. Unwashed bodies, laudanum, chloroform, vomit, and blood, burning soap over it all. By contrast, the soot and refuse outside seemed like a burst of clean country breeze. Suddenly a head appeared in the window from outside. It was one of the attendants, a ginger-haired man with only half a nose. His eyes widened when he saw Hatcher and Alice in the room. He started to climb back inside. Before the man could get any further than throwing one leg over the sill, Hatcher was upon him. He punched the man in the face hard with his left hand, twice, 3 times. Then he kicked the man in the side so hard Alice heard ribs break. Finally, he pushed the now unconscious attendant out the window, looking out after the falling man to follow his progress to the river below. He nodded in satisfaction before turning back to Alice. I was the one who bit half his nose off. He was going back to make sure we wouldn't get out. Do you see? You never let us leave.